the echoes of Pine Hollow. The forest seemed alive as the four friends Jason, Emily, Maya, and Luke pitched their tents in Pine Hollow. It was the type of place you'd see on postcards. Towering pines, a crystal clear lake, and a sky that turned pink and orange at dusk. They had all agreed that a weekend away from their phones, stress, and the noise of the city would be perfect. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest turned to shadow, Pine Hollow revealed its true nature. Anyone else feel like we're being watched? Maya's voice was soft, but her unease was clear. Luke rolled his eyes as he tossed another log onto the campfire. Come Monday, Maya. You've been saying that since we got here. It's just nature, not some Netflix horror special. Emily chuckled, but Jason gave a wary glance over his shoulder. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No chirping crickets, no rustling of leaves. Just the crackling fire and the occasional pop of embers. Let's tell a ghost story, Jason suggested, trying to lighten the mood. We're in the perfect spot for it. Luke smirked. All right, but let's make it good. As the group exchanged eerie tales, the darkness beyond the fire seemed to press closer. Emily swore she saw movement in the shadows, but when she looked again, there was nothing. Halfway through Luke's story about a haunted lake, the fire dimmed, as if an unseen hand was smothering it. Did you feel that? Emily asked, her voice trembling. The temperature just dropped. Jason glanced at the fire. Weird? Maybe the wind? There's no wind, Maya whispered. She clutched her blanket tighter, her eyes darting around the campfire's edge. The fire sputtered again, this time almost going out completely. Then they heard it, a faint whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. Did you hear that? Mia's voice cracked. Hear what? Luke asked, though his bravado was starting to fade. Shh, Emily hissed. The group fell silent, straining their ears. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the trees. It wasn't just one voice. It sounded like many, overlapping, speaking in a language none of them could understand. Jason stood abruptly, grabbing the flashlight. Okay, this is weird. Maybe someone's out there messing with us. I'm going to check it out. Are you insane? Maya grabbed his arm. What if it's not someone? Stay here. Stay here. I'll be right back. Jason pulled away and disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the trees. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, suffocating. Emily stared into the woods, hoping to see Jason's light. Minutes passed, then a scream tore through the forest. Jason! Emily shot to her feet, her heart pounding. Luke grabbed a burning stick from the fire. Stay here, he said, his voice shaking. I'll go find him. Like hell you're going alone. Emily grabbed another flashlight, and the two of them ventured into the trees, leaving Maya behind. The forest was darker than they expected. The flashlight barely illuminated the ground in front of them. The pines loomed overhead, their branches twisting into skeletal shapes. Jason, Emily called out, her voice trembling. No answer. Then the whispering returned. It was louder now, surrounding them. Luke spun in circles, trying to pinpoint the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Emily, Luke's voice was barely a whisper. What? He pointed ahead. There, in the beam of her flashlight, stood Jason, or what looked like him. His back was to them, and he was unnaturally still. Jason! Emily cried, running toward him. Wait, Luke grabbed her arm, stopping her. Jason's head turned slowly, too slowly. When his face came into view, Emily screamed. His eyes were completely black, and his mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin. Run, he said, his voice layered with a chorus of others. Emily and Luke turned and bolted back to the campsite. When they arrived, the fire was out, and Maya was gone. Maya! Emily shouted, her voice breaking. A faint giggle echoed from the woods, followed by the whispers. They're toying with us, Luke said, gripping the burning stick like a weapon. What are they? Emily sobbed. A shadow shifted at the edge of the campsite. Then another, and another. Figures began to emerge, their forms blurry like static on an old TV. Their faces were twisted and grotesque, and their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. Emily backed up until she hit Luke. "We can't stay here." "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice trembling. The figures moved closer, their whispers now deafening. Emily spotted Jason's car parked at the edge of the campsite. "The car!" The two sprinted for it, but the forest seemed alive, roots and branches reaching out to trip them. Emily fell, scraping her hands and knees, but Luke yanked her to her feet. They barely made it to the car. Emily fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking as the figures closed in. The engine roared to life, and they sped down the dirt road, leaving the whispers and shadows behind. When they reached the main road, they didn't stop. Not until the forest was miles behind them. The two sat in silence, catching their breath, then Emily glanced in the rearview mirror. Jason sat in the back seat, his black eyes staring back at her. Here is the second story. The Last Campfire. When Sarah, Dylan, and their younger brother, Max, decided to camp at Wolf's Ridge, they didn't realize they were walking into the site of an infamous tragedy. Dylan had heard vague rumors about the place, a hiker disappearing here, a camper going missing there, but nothing serious enough to keep them away. The spot they found was perfect, a clearing surrounded by tall, ancient trees with a breathtaking view of the valley below. They pitched their tents, built a fire, and spent the day hiking and taking photos. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the siblings gathered around the campfire. Max, the youngest, was poking at the flames with a stick. "What's the scariest thing you've ever heard about camping?" he asked, grinning at his older sibling. Sarah rolled her eye. "Max, we're not doing ghost stories. You'll just scare yourself and beg to sleep in my tent." "I will not," Max protested. Dylan smirked. "All right, Max. You want scary? I've got a real one." The youngest leaned in eagerly as Dylan began. A long time ago, before this place was a campsite, there was a group of settlers who tried to make a home here, but something went wrong. The settlers started disappearing one by one. Some blamed the wild animals, others thought it was starvation, but the survivors said it was something else. "What?" Max asked, eyes wide. "They called it the Shadow Man." Dylan's voice dropped to a whisper. "A tall figure with no face that lived in the woods. He only appeared at night, and if he found you, you were never seen again." "Stop it!" Sarah snapped, throwing a marshmallow at Dylan. "You're gonna scare him." But Max just laughed nervously. "That's not even real." "Yeah?" Dylan said. "Then why do they say no one who camps at Wolf's Ridge ever stays past midnight?" Sarah rolled her eyes and stood up. "All right, you two, I'm going to bed." "Don't stay up too late." She ducked into her tent, leaving Dylan and Max by the fire. The night deepened, and the forest grew quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. "Do you hear that?" Max whispered. "What?" Dylan asked, though he'd noticed it too. "Nothing." A branch cracked nearby, loud and deliberate. Dylan stood, shining his flashlight into the woods. The beam illuminated nothing but trees. "Probably just an animal," Dylan muttered, but Max wasn't convinced. "What if it's the Shadow Man?" "Don't be stupid," Dylan said, but his voice lacked conviction. Another sound came, this time closer, a low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. "Sarah," Dylan called out, but there was no response. Then they saw it. Fire! At the edge of the firelight, something moved between the trees. A tall, humanoid shape, its body unnaturally thin and elongated. The fire flickered, casting shadows that made it hard to tell if it was real or a trick of the light. Max grabbed Dylan's arm. "That's not an animal." "Stay calm," Dylan whispered, pulling Max closer to the fire. The figure stepped closer, just enough for them to see it more clearly. Its face, or lack thereof, was the stuff of nightmares. Where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin. Its body was wrapped in tattered black rags that fluttered unnaturally, though there was no wind. Max screamed. The creature tilted its head, as if studying them, then took another step forward. Dylan grabbed a burning stick from the fire and waved it toward the thing. "Stay back!" he shouted. The figure stopped, but only for a moment. Then it raised a long, bony arm and pointed toward the tents. "Sarah," Dylan realized. "Get Sarah." Max sprinted to his sister's tent, unzipping it with shaky hands. "Sarah, wake up!" But Sarah wasn't there. Her sleeping bag was empty. "Dylan!" Max screamed, but when he turned back to the fire, Dylan was gone too. The creature stood in the clearing, alone with Max. Its eyeless face seemed to look right through him, and its hand extended again, pointing toward the woods. Max ran. He didn't stop, even when the branches cut his face and his lungs burned. The whispers started as he ran low and guttural, a language he couldn't understand. They came from all directions, growing louder until it felt like they were inside his head. Finally, he tripped and fell into a small ravine. He huddled there, his body shaking as the whispers faded. For a moment, the forest was still. Then he heard his sister's voice. "Max? Max, where are you?" He stood, his heart leaping with hope. "Sarah!" He followed her voice, but as he got closer, something felt wrong. The tone of her voice was off, too flat, too cold. "Max," her voice echoed, now coming from multiple directions. He stopped in his tracks. From the shadows ahead, his sister stepped into view. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty. Behind her, Dylan appeared, his expression just as blank. "Come with us," Sarah said, her voice unnatural. Max took a step back. "You're not real." The shadows around them shifted, growing taller and darker, until they formed a single massive figure. The last thing Max saw was the faceless creature towering over him, its hand reaching out. By morning, the campsite was empty. The fire had burned out, and the tents were abandoned. The locals would later tell hikers about Wolf's Ridge and the shadow man who haunted its woods. But the warning always came too late. Here is the third story. The lantern on Dead Man's Trail. The 5 friends, Jake, Clara, Sam, Ben, and Lily, weren't the superstitious type. When they heard about Dead Man's Trail, they laughed it off as nothing more than a spooky urban legend. The trail, which cut through the densest part of Blackwood Forest, was rumored to be haunted by a man who'd gone missing over a century ago. Some said his spirit wandered the woods carrying an old lantern, luring unsuspecting hikers to their doom. Of course, this made it the perfect spot for their annual camping trip. "This place is supposed to be haunted," Sam teased, stepping over a gnarled root as the group hiked deeper into the forest. "Looks more like a retirement home for squirrel." Clara smirked. "Right? I was expecting creepy vibes. This just feels like a forest." Ben, the skeptic of the group, chuckled. "Urban legends are just stories people tell to scare each other. Dead Man's Trail is probably named after some boring history no one cares about anymore." But Lily, the quietest of the bunch, stopped in her track. "It's not just a story," she said softly. Jake glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "I looked it up before we came," Lily admitted, her voice hesitant. "There was a logger named Henry Clark who used to live in these woods. He went missing one night during a storm. Some people think he got lost in the dark and fell into one of the ravines. They say his lantern was found hanging from a tree branch, but his body was never recovered." "Cool story," Sam said, clearly unimpressed. "Let's keep moving before it gets dark." The group continued hiking until they found a small clearing by a stream to set up camp. As they built a fire and ate dinner, the mood was lighthearted, filled with laughter and stories. But as the night deepened, an unsettling stillness crept over the woods. The breeze that had rustled the leaves earlier was gone. The stream's gentle gurgling seemed quieter. Even the fire's crackle felt muted. "I don't like this," Lily whispered, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. "You're just psyching yourself out," Ben said. though his voice lacked its usual confidence. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, a faint light appeared. "What's that?" Jake asked, pointing toward the trees. It was small and flickering, swaying slightly as though someone was carrying it. "Probably another camper," Sam said, though his voice wavered. "At this hour?" Claire replied. "Who hikes this late?" The light grew brighter, bobbing closer and closer until they could make out its source. An old-fashioned lantern. It swung rhythmically, as if held by an invisible hand. "Hello?" Jake called, stepping toward the edge of the clearing. The lantern stopped. It hovered in place, flickering, as if considering him. "Don't," Lily whispered, grabbing Jake's arm. Her grip was ice cold. "Why not?" Jake asked. But Lily's eyes were fixed on the lantern. "It's him." Before anyone could respond, the light began to move again, this time darting deeper into the woods. "It wants us to follow," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Absolutely not," Ben said firmly. But Jake, always the curious one, grabbed a flashlight and started walking toward the trees. "Jake, stop," Lily pleaded, but he didn't listen. The others exchanged nervous glances before following him, not wanting to leave him alone. The forest felt different as they walked, colder and darker than before. The lantern stayed just far enough ahead to keep them chasing it, its golden glow casting eerie shadows on the trees. "This is a bad idea," Claire muttered. The whispers started then, soft and indistinct at first, like the wind through the trees. But soon, they became voices low, guttural, overlapping. "Do you hear that?" Ben asked, his flashlight beam shaking as he swept it across the trees. The others nodded, their fear mounting. The lantern led them to a clearing, where it stopped abruptly, hanging in midair. Beneath it was an ancient, gnarled tree. The bark was blackened and split, as if it had been struck by lightning. "What is this place?" Claire whispered. Before anyone could answer, the lantern's light flared bright, illuminating the tree and the noose hanging from one of its branches. "Oh my God," Lily breathed, stepping back. The whispers grew louder, now distinctly angry. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the forest itself was closing in on them. "We need to leave," Ben said, his voice panicked. The lantern suddenly dropped to the ground, shattering on impact. Darkness swallowed the clearing, leaving only the faint beam of their flashlights. Then they saw him. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and gaunt, his face pale and featureless except for two hollow, glowing eyes. His clothes were ragged, his boots caked with mud, and his skeletal hands clutched an axe that gleamed in the dim light. "Run!" Jake shouted, but the figure raised the axe and let out a guttural scream that froze them in place. The next moments were chaos. The group scattered, sprinting through the woods in different directions, the whispers and heavy footsteps chasing them. Lily tripped and fell, her flashlight skittering away. As she scrambled to her feet, she felt cold breath on her neck. When she turned, he was there. The glowing eyes bore into hers, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The last thing she saw was the axe coming down. By morning, the campsite was empty. The tents were still there, the fire was cold, but the friends were nowhere to be found. Hikers who ventured through Dead Man's Trail in the years that followed spoke of strange lights and whispers in the woods. Some claimed to see a lantern swinging in the distance, while others swore they heard the sound of an axe being sharpened. None of them stayed long enough to find out if the stories were true.